San Quentin State Prison, Marin County, California. August 21, 1971. It's 2:30 in the afternoon. The sun is beating down on the bay. Alcatraz sits in the distance like a ghost across the water. Inside the adjustment center, San Quentin's maximum security unit within maximum security, something is happening. Guards are running. Alarms are sounding. The entire facility goes into lockdown. Within minutes, 3 guards and 2 inmate trustees are dead. Their throats cut. Their bodies scattered across the tier. And George Lester Jackson, 29 years old, Black Panther Field Marshal, revolutionary writer, prisoner number A72777, is running across the prison yard toward the outside wall. He almost makes it. Almost. A sharpshooter in the tower fires once. The bullet hits George Jackson in the back of the head. He falls in the yard, face down in the California dirt, dead at 29. But here's what you need to understand. George Jackson didn't die that day. Not really. His body died. But his ideas, forged over 11 years in California's prison system, written from solitary confinement cells, smuggled out in letters and manuscripts, those ideas were already everywhere, already in the hands of millions. George Jackson walked into California's prison system at 18 as a confused, angry kid from Chicago's South Side. He walked out in a box. But in between, he became something the prison system never expected. A man who turned his cage into a classroom, his chains into a microphone, and his suffering into a revolution. This is his story. All of it. The real one. George Lester Jackson was born September 23, 1941, in Chicago, Illinois. He grew up in the brutal reality of mid-century Black America. Chicago's South Side was a world of poverty, overcrowding, racial segregation, and daily indignity. The kind of place where the systems designed to help you, schools, police, courts, felt designed to crush you instead. George's father, Robert Jackson, worked multiple jobs trying to keep the family together. His mother, Georgia, was strong, devoted, determined. They were a working-class family trying to navigate an America that had very specific ideas about what Black people were worth. George was smart, unusually smart. Teachers noticed early that he had a sharp mind, quick to absorb information, quick to question things. But smart doesn't protect you from a system designed to swallow you whole. George got into trouble young. Small things at first, the kind of petty offenses that get white kids a slap on the wrist and Black kids a criminal record. Break-ins, theft, the survival crimes of poverty. His family moved to Los Angeles hoping for better. It wasn't. By the time George was 18, he'd accumulated a juvenile record and a reputation for not backing down. When you're a young Black man in 1960 Los Angeles with attitude and a record, the system has very clear plans for you. In September 1960, George Jackson was accused of participating in a $70 gas station robbery. $70. His lawyer advised him to plead guilty, told him he'd likely get probation or a very light sentence. George was 18, first serious adult offense, small amount. He took the plea. The judge sentenced him to 1 year to life under California's indeterminate sentencing law. 1 year to life. For $70. George Jackson would never be free again. Let's stop here because this is crucial to understanding everything that follows. California's indeterminate sentencing law in 1960 meant that George's sentence had no fixed endpoint. The adult authority, a parole board, decided every year whether to release him. On paper, this sounded humane. Rehabilitation over punishment. Release when you're ready. In practice, for Black men, it was a trap. Every year, George would appear before the adult authority. Every year, they'd evaluate his behavior. And every year, they'd decide, not ready for release. What did ready mean? It meant compliant, docile, grateful, showing appropriate deference to white authority. George Jackson was none of those things. He was becoming more politically aware, more intellectually developed, more openly radical with every passing year. His politics disqualified him from parole. His refusal to perform submission, to bow his head, soften his voice, become what they wanted, meant he stayed in. Over 11 years, George appeared before the parole board multiple times. Each time, denied. His sentence for a $70 robbery stretched to 2 years. Then 5. Then 8. Then 11. The prison system wasn't just punishing George Jackson for what he'd done. It was punishing him for what he was becoming. And what he was becoming terrified them. George's journey through California's prison system took him to multiple facilities, but it was Soledad Prison in Monterey County where his transformation truly began. Soledad in the 1960s was one of California's most racially tense prisons. Guards openly favored white inmates. Racial violence was constant. The Black and Latino populations were systematically brutalized and dehumanized. But Soledad also had a library, and a small but fierce intellectual community of Black prisoners who were reading, debating, organizing. George threw himself into books with the same intensity he'd once put into survival on the streets. He read everything. Marx, Lenin, Mao, Fanon, Du Bois, Malcolm X and Nkrumah. He read history, philosophy, economics, military strategy. He read the revolutionaries of Africa, Asia, Latin America. And piece by piece, he began to construct a framework for understanding his own life. Why he was poor, why he was in prison, why so many Black men around him were in prison. What connected the gas station robbery conviction to the broader systems of American capitalism and white supremacy. Other prisoners noticed. George became a teacher. He'd gather small groups in the yard, in cells, wherever they could talk. He'd explain what he was reading, help others understand the political dimensions of their own imprisonment. The authorities noticed too. They began watching him closely, transferring him when he started gaining influence, putting him in isolation when he taught too effectively. But isolation backfired. In isolation, George could write. Subscribe right now because what George Jackson produced from solitary confinement and who it reached on the outside changed American history. January 13, 1970. Soledad Prison. In the exercise yard, a white guard named Opie Miller opens a gate allowing Black and white prisoners into the same space simultaneously, something that almost never happened, and when it did, always led to violence. Violence broke out. Miller shot into the yard. 3 Black prisoners were killed. A grand jury ruled the killings justifiable homicide. 3 days later, a white guard named John Mills was found beaten to death. 3 Black prisoners were charged with the murder: George Jackson, John Clutchett, and Fleeta Drumgo. They became known as the Soledad Brothers. George maintained his innocence throughout. Whether he was directly responsible or not, the charges represented something larger to him. The prison system executing Black prisoners through guards and then using the law to execute the prisoners who responded. The Soledad Brothers case became a national cause. Civil rights organizations, radical movements, celebrities, everyone was paying attention. But the case also brought someone else into George's life. A young communist professor named Angela Davis, who became one of the most vocal advocates for the Soledad Brothers. And it solidified something in George's mind. The prison walls were not just physical barriers. They were political walls. And he would use every tool available to tear them down. While fighting his case, George was writing. He wrote letters constantly. To his family, to activists, to attorneys, to journalists, to anyone who would listen. His younger brother Jonathan collected these letters, organized them, smuggled them out. They were raw, powerful, intellectually sophisticated dispatches from inside the machine. George's writing mixed personal testimony with political analysis. He described the daily realities of prison, the dehumanization, the racial violence, the psychological manipulation, the deliberate destruction of Black identity. But he also analyzed these realities theoretically. Drawing on his years of reading, he argued that American prisons were not aberrations. They were features of a capitalist system designed to control the poor, the black, the rebellious. His argument was radical and, to many, devastatingly persuasive, that the prisoner was the most honest product of American society. That the poor man who steals to survive is simply doing openly what corporations and governments do covertly. That the prison cell is where America sends the people it has failed and the people who see through it. These letters were eventually compiled by his lawyer, Faye Stender, into a book published in 1970. It was called Soledad Brother, The Prison Letters of George Jackson. It changed everything. Soledad Brother was published by Coward McCann in October 1970. It had a foreword by French existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, which immediately signaled this was not an ordinary prison memoir. The book exploded. It hit the New York Times bestseller list. It was read by black activists, white radicals, academics, politicians, ordinary people who'd never thought about what happened inside prison walls. What struck readers was the writing itself. George Jackson's prose was visceral and precise. He could describe the smell of a prison cell and connect it to the history of slavery in the same paragraph. He could be furious and analytical simultaneously. He wrote about watching black men destroy each other in prison yards while guards laughed. About seeing the most intelligent, potentially transformative men in his community warehoused and broken. About his own evolution from street kid to revolutionary. He wrote about his father, painful letters working through their complicated relationship. About his mother's visits, seeing her age through prison glass. About his brother Jonathan, 15 years younger, whom he loved desperately and worried about constantly. And he wrote about his refusal to be broken. His determination that 11 years in a cage, in isolation, in solitary, had not destroyed his humanity, had, in fact, deepened it. The book was a sensation internationally, translated into dozens of languages. Read in Europe, Africa, Latin America, Asia. The prison system had tried to make George Jackson disappear. Instead, it had inadvertently created one of the most powerful radical voices of the 20th century. George's brother Jonathan was born in 1953, 12 years younger. By the time George went to prison, Jonathan was just 7 years old. He grew up watching his brother disappear into the California prison system year after year, visiting him through glass, writing letters, watching the parole board deny his release again and again. Jonathan worshipped George, saw in him everything the system was trying to destroy: intelligence, dignity, revolutionary spirit, black manhood. As Jonathan grew up, he became increasingly politicized, shaped by his brother's letters, by the Black Power movement, by watching America's racism in operation through his family's experience. By 1970, Jonathan was 17 years old, increasingly committed to radical politics, and increasingly desperate to free his brother. What he was planning, almost nobody knew. On August 7, 1970, Jonathan Jackson walked into the Marin County Courthouse. He was carrying multiple weapons. He took Judge Harold Haley, the prosecutor, and 3 jurors hostage. He armed 3 San Quentin inmates who were there for a hearing. They demanded the release of the Soledad brothers. The escape attempt failed catastrophically. In the parking lot outside, a shootout erupted with police. Jonathan Jackson was killed. He was 17 years old. Judge Haley was killed. 2 of the inmates were killed. The prosecutor was shot and paralyzed. George received the news of Jonathan's death in his cell. He had 1 year left to live. The death of Jonathan destroyed something in George and rebuilt something else. His letters after Jonathan's death are among the most emotionally raw documents in American prison literature. He wrote about his guilt, that Jonathan had done this for him, that his younger brother, who should have had a whole life ahead of him, was dead because the prison system had swallowed George and wouldn't let go. He wrote to his mother, "John was the only part of my life that made sense to me outside of books." He also wrote with a new fury. Jonathan's death didn't make George more moderate. It made him more resolved, more certain that the system he'd been analyzing for a decade was exactly as monstrous as he'd said. After the Marin County Courthouse events, Angela Davis was charged with murder and conspiracy. She'd purchased some of the weapons Jonathan used, legally, for her own protection. She went underground, was captured, and became the subject of a massive international defense campaign. George, meanwhile, was transferred to San Quentin, one of California's oldest and most brutal prisons, and placed in the Adjustment Center, the most restrictive unit, essentially solitary confinement within solitary confinement. He continued writing. His second book, Blood in My Eye, was nearly complete. It was darker, more explicitly revolutionary, more militarized in its thinking. Where Soledad Brother was a cry of anguish and analysis, Blood in My Eye was a call to arms. He was running out of time. Somehow, somewhere inside him, he knew it. The Adjustment Center at San Quentin was designed for one purpose: to destroy the human capacity for resistance. It was a prison within a prison. Inmates were held in their cells 23 hours a day. Exercise was alone in a small cage. Human contact was minimal. The psychological pressure was continuous and deliberate. George had been in similar conditions for years at various points in his imprisonment. But the Adjustment Center was particularly intense. The guards knew who George Jackson was. Some were intimidated by him. Some hated him openly. The racial climate in San Quentin was explosive. California's prisons in 1970 to 71 were powder kegs of racial violence, political radicalism, and institutional brutality. Black prisoners organized under various formations. The Black Guerrilla Family, which George had helped found, was growing in influence. White prisoners organized under the Aryan Brotherhood. Mexican prisoners under the Mexican Mafia. San Quentin was a microcosm of an America tearing itself apart. Vietnam, civil rights, Black Power, Nixon, the entire social upheaval of the era concentrated behind 30-foot walls. George moved through this environment like he was studying it, writing constantly, corresponding with activists and intellectuals outside, maintaining his political work even in the most restrictive conditions, and planning something the prison authorities feared without fully understanding. Even as he was being held in the Adjustment Center's most restrictive conditions, George was finishing Blood in My Eye. The book was different from Soledad Brother, less autobiographical, more explicitly political and strategic. It drew on Mao, Che Guevara, Frantz Fanon, and other revolutionary theorists to construct a framework for armed struggle against American capitalism. George argued that reform was impossible, that the system was too entrenched, too violent, too self-perpetuating, that the only path to liberation was organized resistance. He analyzed the prison system as a laboratory for American fascism, argued that what happened to black men in California's prisons was a preview of what the American state intended for all poor and working-class people. His analysis of the lumpen proletariat, the underclass of criminals, the homeless, the chronically poor, as a potentially revolutionary class drew directly on his own experience. These were his people, the people the system had created and then criminalized. The manuscript was being smuggled out page by page through his attorney and activists outside. George knew the authorities were watching him constantly, knew his mail was read, his visits monitored, his movements tracked. He also knew, because he'd been told directly in various ways, that there were people who wanted him dead. He had been in prison for 11 years. He was 29 years old. He wrote with the urgency of someone who understood his time was limited. August 21st, 1971. What actually happened that day at San Quentin remains, more than 50 years later, genuinely contested. Here is what is established. George Jackson was taken to an attorney visit in the morning. He returned to the Adjustment Center in the early afternoon. Shortly after, violence erupted. 3 guards, Paul Krasner, Frank DeLeon, and Jerry Graham, were killed. Their throats cut. 2 inmate trustees were also killed. George Jackson was found dead in the yard, shot from a tower. The bullet entered the back of his head. The official California Department of Corrections narrative: Jackson smuggled a gun into the facility in his afro hairstyle during the attorney visit. His attorney, Stephen Bingham, was subsequently charged and spent years as a fugitive. He was eventually tried and acquitted in 1986. The plan was an escape attempt. It went wrong. Many people, Jackson's supporters, independent investigators, scholars, disputed this account then and now. Questions that remain unresolved. Was the gun story plausible given the security measures? Did guards have prior knowledge? Was there a setup? The prison had every reason to want George Jackson dead. He was the most influential radical prisoner in America, actively organizing, writing revolutionary literature, inspiring prisoners nationwide. What nobody disputes: George Jackson died in the San Quentin yard, 29 years old, after 11 years in prison for a $70 robbery. If you're realizing how much of this story you never learned in school, hit that like button. Because what happened after George Jackson's death proved everything he'd been saying. George Jackson was killed on August 21, 1971. On September 9, 1971, 18 days later, prisoners at Attica Correctional Facility in New York took over the prison in the largest prison uprising in American history. The connection was explicit. Prisoners at Attica wore black armbands in memory of George Jackson. His name was invoked in their demands. His analysis of the prison system as a tool of racial and class oppression was central to their grievances. Attica's prisoners, overwhelmingly black and Latino, listed demands: better food, medical care, educational opportunities, an end to racial discrimination, fair parole procedures, religious freedom. These were not radical demands. They were basic human dignity. New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller refused to negotiate personally. On September 13th, he ordered state police to retake the prison. Helicopters dropped tear gas. Troopers opened fire. When it was over, 43 people were dead, 10 hostages and 33 prisoners. The hostages were killed not by prisoners, as initial reports claimed, but by the state's gunfire. George Jackson's analysis that the prison system was a killing machine directed at poor and black Americans had been confirmed in the most brutal possible way. Blood in My Eye was published posthumously in 1972. The irony was profound. The prison system had killed George Jackson to silence him. Instead, it gave him a martyrdom that amplified his voice beyond anything he could have achieved alive. Soledad Brother was already a global bestseller. Blood in My Eye sold through multiple printings. Together, the two books made George Jackson one of the most read radical writers of the 1970s. His influence spread in directions no one anticipated. In West Germany, a radical group read his books and cited him as a primary influence. In France, his work was discussed in the same breath as Sartre and Fanon. In South Africa, prisoners on Robben Island, including Nelson Mandela, had access to his letters and discussed his analysis. In American prisons, Soledad Brother became practically sacred text. Passed hand to hand, read until covers fell off. Memoized in solitary cells. George Jackson had argued that the prisoner was the most honest product of American society. That argument, delivered through his extraordinary writing, reached people who had never been near a prison and convinced them he was right. George Jackson was one of the founders of the Black Guerrilla Family, BGF, established in California's prison system around 1966. Understanding the BGF requires understanding the context. California's prisons in the 1960s were extraordinarily violent, racially segregated systems where black prisoners had almost no protection or power. The BGF was formed partly as a political organization, explicitly Maoist, connected to the Black Power movement, and partly as a defensive structure for black prisoners. George's influence on the BGF's founding ideology was significant. He shaped its explicitly political character, its connection to outside radical movements, its framing of prisoner resistance as legitimate revolutionary activity. After his death, the BGF evolved, sometimes in directions George might not have recognized. Like many organizations born in extreme circumstances, it developed contradictions between its political ideology and the brutal realities of prison survival. But its founding impulse, that black prisoners were political prisoners in a system designed to criminalize and destroy black life, remained rooted in George Jackson's analysis. The organization he helped create persists to this day, a complex and contested legacy of a man who believed that organizing inside prison was as legitimate as any other form of political resistance. The story of George Jackson cannot be told without the women who fought for him. His mother, Georgia Jackson, spent years organizing for her son's release and the release of the Soledad Brothers. She sat through parole hearings, spoke at rallies, organized community support. She watched her youngest son die at 17 trying to free his brother. She watched her oldest son die 8 days before his 30th birthday. Georgia Jackson never stopped speaking about what the prison system had done to her family. She lived decades after George, carrying the weight of both sons. His attorney, Faye Stender, was crucial to getting Soledad Brother published and to the Soledad Brothers' defense. She worked with extraordinary dedication for her clients before eventually leaving the legal system. She was shot by a BGF member in 1979 in a tragic and painful episode that showed how complex and sometimes violent the legacies of revolutionary movements could become. Angela Davis, though never romantically involved with George despite prison authorities' attempts to use their correspondence against her, was politically transformed by the Soledad Brothers case. Her own incarceration and internationally supported defense campaign became one of the emblematic political struggles of the era. These women, and many others, understood that George Jackson was more than one man. He was a symbol of what the American prison system was doing to an entire generation. Stephen Bingham was the attorney who visited George Jackson on the morning of August 21, 1971. After Jackson's death and the violence at the Adjustment Center, Bingham was charged with smuggling the gun that allegedly enabled the events. He went underground. He remained a fugitive for 13 years, living under assumed names, working menial jobs, never forgetting. In 1984, Bingham surfaced voluntarily. He'd decided to return, face the charges, and present his case in court. His trial in 1986 was a re-examination of August 21, 1971. 15 years after the events, questions about what actually happened that day were finally aired in a courtroom. The jury acquitted Bingham on all counts. The acquittal didn't resolve the historical questions about August 21, but it raised them publicly. And it suggested that the prison system's official account of George Jackson's final day was significantly more complicated than authorities had claimed. Bingham's story, 13 years as a fugitive, voluntary surrender, acquittal, is its own extraordinary chapter in the story of San Quentin and the Jackson case. Comment right now, before this video, had you ever heard George Jackson's name? Because this story was deliberately removed from American history education. Let me know below. After the Soledad Brothers case, after Attica, after all the organizing and writing and deaths, what changed? Some things did, temporarily. California's indeterminate sentencing law, the specific mechanism that had trapped George Jackson, was eventually reformed. California moved to determinate sentencing in 1976, meaning sentences had fixed endpoints rather than parole board discretion. Conditions in some prisons improved marginally. Some of the most obviously brutal practices were curtailed, if only because they'd become too embarrassing. But the fundamental analysis George Jackson had made, that American prisons were tools of racial and class control rather than rehabilitation systems, was not only unaddressed but actively accelerated. The 1970s gave way to the 1980s. Ronald Reagan's war on drugs, mandatory minimum sentences, 3 strikes laws, The American prison population, which was around 300,000 when George Jackson died in 1971, began climbing. It would reach 500,000 by 1980, 1 million by 1990, 2 million by 2000. The United States, which in 1971 was worried about being too punitive, became the most incarcerated nation on earth. It remains so today. More than half of those incarcerated are Black or Latino, in a country where Black and Latino people are approximately 30% of the population. The numbers George Jackson was analyzing in 1970 have gotten dramatically worse. His analysis has become, in the decades since his death, more relevant rather than less. George Jackson's influence spread beyond politics into American culture in ways that are still felt today. Bob Dylan wrote a song called George Jackson, released in November 1971, barely 3 months after Jackson's death, one of Dylan's fastest responses to a political event. The song described Jackson's trajectory from 18-year-old prisoner to revolutionary voice to death in a prison yard. Jackson's writing directly influenced the development of prison literature as a legitimate genre. Writers including James Baldwin, who corresponded with Jackson and was devastated by his death, saw in Jackson's work a demonstration that the most profound American writing was emerging from the most excluded American spaces. Hip-hop, born in the 1970s in exactly the communities George Jackson had written about, carries his DNA. The analysis of American racism, of police and prisons as tools of social control, of the criminalization of Black poverty. These themes run through decades of Black music, from Gil Scott-Heron to Tupac Shakur to Kendrick Lamar. When contemporary artists describe the prison industrial complex, when they analyze mass incarceration, when they describe the school-to-prison pipeline, they are working in an intellectual tradition George Jackson helped establish from a solitary confinement cell in California. He didn't know that was what he was doing. He was just trying to understand why he was in a cage. The understanding he produced outlasted the cage. San Quentin State Prison still stands on the Marin County waterfront. The same bay, the same towers, the same walls where George Jackson's body fell in 1971. In recent years, California has moved to transform San Quentin. A 2023 announcement described plans to convert it to a rehabilitation and education center, a Hope campus modeled on Scandinavian prison models. The announcement was met with complicated reactions from people who'd spent their lives engaged with Jackson's legacy. On one hand, the shift toward rehabilitation over punishment was exactly what prison reformers had demanded for decades. On the other hand, the same California prison system that had killed George Jackson was now positioning itself as a progressive rehabilitation model. The adjustment center where Jackson was held has been closed. The cells where he spent years in solitary confinement are empty. San Quentin has housed over 250,000 prisoners since it opened in 1852. The names of almost none of them are remembered. The ones who are remembered are mostly remembered for their crimes. George Jackson is remembered for his ideas. That's an unusual outcome for a man who entered the California prison system at 18 for a $70 robbery. It says something about the power of thought, about what happens when you take the most unjust situation imaginable and refuse to let it make you less than human. There's a temptation, decades later, to flatten George Jackson into a symbol. The martyred revolutionary, the Black Panther field marshal, the prison writer. But reading his actual letters, the personal ones, the ones to his father, to his mother, to his brother, you find something more human and more painful than a symbol. You find a young man who knew he'd made mistakes, who understood that the $70 robbery that landed him in prison was real, that he'd done it, that there were consequences for choices. But who also understood that the consequences he was experiencing, 11 years and counting, potentially life, for a $70 robbery, bore no relationship to justice. You find a man who loved his family with extraordinary depth and was tormented by what his imprisonment did to them, who watched his little brother idolize him and worried about what that idolization might lead to, and was right to worry, and couldn't stop it. You find a thinker who genuinely believed that ideas could change reality, that if enough people understood how the system actually worked, not the mythology, but the machinery, they would demand something different. Whether you agree with George Jackson's political conclusions or not, and many people don't, his underlying demand was simple: that a $70 robbery should not end a life, that the prison system should not be used to warehouse and destroy an entire generation of black men, that human beings, regardless of what they've done, retain dignity. These are not radical ideas. They are the ideas America claims to believe in. George Jackson just pointed out, with meticulous and painful detail, where the gap between the claim and the reality was largest. George Lester Jackson entered the California prison system on January 1961 at 18 years old. He left it on August 21, 1971, in a box, 30 years old, a bullet from a prison tower in his skull. Between those two dates, he served 11 years for a $70 robbery that under any reasonable sentencing standard would have resulted in 1 to 3 years. In those 11 years, he educated himself comprehensively in revolutionary thought, became one of the most significant political organizers in the California prison system, wrote thousands of letters that were compiled into 2 books read worldwide, helped found an organization that persists to this day, inspired a generation of activists, writers, and prisoners, became a global symbol of resistance to racial capitalism and mass incarceration. The prison system that held George Jackson was convinced it was containing a danger. It was actually creating a legacy. That's the deepest irony of the George Jackson story. The system that tried to erase him wrote his name larger with every year it held him, every restriction it imposed, every parole denial it issued. The adjustment center couldn't adjust him. Solitary couldn't isolate his ideas. The bullet that killed him couldn't kill what he'd written. More than 50 years after his death, American prisons hold more than 2 million people. The majority are poor. The majority are black or Latino. The conditions George Jackson described, the racial violence, the dehumanization, the use of imprisonment as social control, are documented in prisons across the country. His books are still in print, still read, still passed hand to hand in prison libraries. When a prisoner today in a California cell opens Soledad Brother for the first time, they read the words of a man who was sitting where they are sitting 50 years ago, who looked at the same walls, endured the same dehumanization, breathed the same institutionalized air, and who refused, against everything the system threw at him, to accept that the walls defined him. That refusal is George Jackson's real legacy, not the politics, not the organization, not even the books. The refusal, the absolute, documented, costly, ultimately fatal refusal to let a cage make him less than human. The walls of San Quentin are still standing. George Jackson has been gone for more than 50 years. But the words he wrote inside those walls are still out here, still breathing, still asking the questions America still hasn't answered. $70, 11 years, a bullet in the yard, and a voice that never stopped. If this story showed you something about American history you were never taught, watch this next video about the Angola prison farm, where prisoners in Louisiana still work the fields of a former slave plantation. The story of George Jackson doesn't end at San Quentin. It continues. Thanks for watching. And remember, the most dangerous thing a prison can do is educate a man who refuses to forget why he's there.